Clapperton Chakanetsa Mavhunga's professional interests lie in the history, theory, and practice of science, technology, innovation, and entrepreneurship in the international context with a focus on Africa. He joined MIT as an assistant professor in 2008 after completing his PhD at the University of Michigan. He is the author of Transient Workspaces, Technologies of Everyday Innovation in Zimbabwe. And his second book is an edited volume, which we'll hear about today, entitled What Do Science, Technology, and Innovation Mean from Africa? Please join me in welcoming Professor Mavhunga.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. I would like to start off by giving just a brief background to how this project came about. It's a progression from my first book, Transient Workspaces. And what I was trying to do in that book was to ask this very important question. Why is it that in the history of technology, science, and innovation, Africa does not seem to be on the map? Is it a question that it does not have any technology, or simply that it has been ignored? So as you know, Africa is a very big continent, 54 countries, probably plus, if you include the islands. And this is not something that you can just, cover inside one book on your own in a short period of time. So I wanted to ask this question on a larger scale, and this was the birth of this book. Take a closer look at the title. The major word there is from. The idea was to take seriously African voices, not just as empirical evidence or a cannon fodder for our theory, but as intellectual agents in their own right. What if we took what they know seriously enough? To do that, I organized a number of scholars, some of them mentors to me, others colleagues at the same level. D.A. Masolo at Louisville, Shadrach Chirikure at University of Cape Town, Jerry Augusto at Brown, Catherine Pippa at KU Leuven, Ron Eglash, who some of you may know, at RPI, Ellen Foster, his student, Tolu Odumosu, and Garrick Lewis, both of them at University of Virginia, both engineers, and their colleagues, Nazima. So the idea was, could we have a conversation across disciplines? I didn't want this idea of us just the science and technology studies people speaking to ourselves. I wanted to open up this conversation to multiple disciplines. The bench sciences, the engineering disciplines, lawyers. The conference that I organized in November 2014 was actually very eclectic, and actually this became the actual title of the book. We haggled over this. Some of you may know from publishing that publishers want a certain type of title for marketing reasons. I said, no, this is the title. Like I said, there's this persistent negative image of Africa. But there is also the agency of some of us working on Africa to escape a rather stifling Western dependence on theory. Could we imagine science, technology, and innovation from, say, our own languages? I look at definitions of science, technology, and innovation today, and I'm sure you would agree that they are very reductionist. Science comes to be removed from all kinds of social dimensions. But as we know, science itself is a social activity. The idea was to restore that and see where we would get. In Africa, for example, it's impossible to reckon with any major innovation without taking seriously religious aspects that undergird the ritual of knowledge production. The same for technology. If you look at technology today, it's as if it's just technical gadgets. And I'm saying this at Google. But it's a whole complex system, social, technical, cultural, etc., etc. My interest was to restore that, but also to disturb the meaning of technology. Is it that obvious? Or could it be something more? Could it be that we are, in reducing it to gadgets, we are missing out on something else? What could that something else be? The same with, if you look at innovation. Innovation has been reduced to this very commercialized, technocentric realm. So what are we to do with those activities that people engage with that fall outside that? Now, why did these conversations occur when they did? This was just a year before I got tenured, 2015. And I was beginning to be frustrated by the insular way in which academia engages with questions that affect the world. And so I began to engage policymakers, for example. Could I see myself playing a role making interventions in policy? I had been conducting research since 2008 on what I call everyday knowledge, that knowledge that sustains people when our nice careers here, when people don't have those careers, they never went to school, or if they were fired from work. Many of these people in Africa go back to what is now called informal sector or the informal economy. What undergirds the informal activity are these skills that you need to go by every day. Most of them are not in the curriculum, in the school curriculum. A good number of them are actually dismissed traditionally as primitive or simply unknowledgeable. So I said I started this project 2008. By then, I had already begun to hear this talk, Africa is rising. You're seeing a new young African who is quite driven to make a difference. There is one generation that still says colonialism is to blame for all our ills. There's another that says, no. We have been independent for a while. Quit this nonsense. This generation that I'm talking about, the younger generation, I felt they needed a different kind of narrative about Africa, deeply rooted in history, but also tackling the key keywords in their own time, like tech, like science, like innovation, like entrepreneurship. And yet, when you look at Africa's history, it's a blank slate. Historians have ignored that. Anthropologists, they are beginning to come around to it. As for engineering, science, and tech, they don't deal with that stuff. So each nation subsists on its own myths and heroes. What kind of heroes would this generation subsist on? That's the basis for writing this book. It was intended for what, since the book was published, is now emerged clearly in my mind as a project of training critical thinker-doers. In other words, is to say that Africa has a lot of critical thinkers, but most of them are not doers. And those that actually do things are not critical thinkers. So how do you bring these two and square the circle? The research that I had done since both during and since PhD had taught me that the best way to be effective in the world is to be humble before knowledge, to not appear like you monopolize the space of common sense and reason. And I was coming from being at MIT as an academic. And what I learned in my fieldwork and through growing up was a lot of knowledge that is handed down from generation to generation through practice. And part of this required me to have to really look at Africa in a different light as somebody was coming back from years in the diaspora. I found that one of the most underestimated strengths, the most underrated assets of Africa is what one would call creative resilience, where even when people's backs are against the wall, they don't just die, roll over and die. They die fighting. And so that creative spirit is often ignored. People just talk about, oh, Africa's people are very resilient. Look at what is thrown at them. No, it's not just resilience. It's also creativity. You can be resilient all you want, but if you are faced with hunger and death, you have to innovate. The concern for me was that a lot of what we are seeing now in the African context in terms of innovation arises out of trying to make do, to deal with a very tough situation. So let me take you through the individual chapters and the process of answering this question: what do science, technology, and innovation mean from Africa? I have said that I convened a meeting at MIT in 2014. I had also organized a previous one in South Africa to recast the idea of laboratory. Why recast it? Because I don't believe that the built laboratory is the only laboratory that exists. If we limit it to that, we are shutting out the door a lot of possibilities. Now, where would you start with this? The first port of call for me was, could we engage philosophers who have been dealing with a lot of these questions about African knowledge? And so in the chapter that D.A. Masolo writes, it's a very interesting example from Egypt. The concern for the afterlife and how it gave rise to the science of mummification. And this discovery of natron, which was used to preserve the body. And one of the theories he advances is that this was the rationale for turning to natron and mummifying a body or preserving it in a fresh state was so that it could travel the journey to the afterlife in a fresh state instead of arriving there in a decomposed state. Now, however we may think about the belief systems of the ancient Egyptians is not the question here. Usually in the past, African knowledge has been dismissed. Oh, this is cuckoo, that can't happen. And yet, when you look at the science that follows, usually that's what we just take and say, okay, this is what we hold on to, the rest is rubbish. Masolo also touches on what is often conceived of as a primitive society in trying to find technology and innovation in that space. The Maasai of Kenya and other parts of East Africa, and how they have been able to both maintain salient aspects of designing spears as well as adopting and adapting some elements that are coming in. In my own chapter, I focused on something different. I wanted to see if we can really think about science from a truly indigenous language. And if we did that, what kind of keywords might we come up with? And what I found was quite interesting. In several parts of the chapter, I give the example of the way in which observations of animals and animal science gave rise to a whole way of defending against enemy attack and constructing defense systems. My best is mice. As a rule, mice always have a plan B. When they dig, they have two exits. One is the obvious one, the other is the other you don't see. So they enter this way. If you wait here and think that the mouse is going to come back this way, and you are ready, poised to hit it, oops, it has already bolted the other way, it's gone. When it digs, there are all these various caverns that it hides in. So you may be digging this way, and it takes a detour and just hides there. Mice are also known to be very good at defending against siege warfare. One example I give there is they stick, and squirrels do this as well, but in this case it was mice. And this had very substantial consequences to the concept of chimurenga. The idea that women would be stocking food in the caves while all the men would be busy mounting the defenses. It was a communal effort. What I'm interested there is not so much the war. I tend to be anti-war. I am much more interested in the idea that you could learn a lot of things from other animals. And I'm sure if you look at some of the science that's coming out, like geck skin, for example, it's coming out of this idea to learn the animal world in order for you to apply it to other purposes. For Shadrach Chirikure, the interesting thing was to think about the laboratory as a site which is not fixed or tethered to space. It's something that is moving. You can lift it and press it somewhere. What remains constant is the practice. And for this example, this is a stunning example of how you could actually build furnaces, blast furnaces in clay in order to smelt iron, and do so in a way that is capable of being shifted elsewhere. And I'm calling this science because how else do you explain the fact that these ironsmiths on the Zimbabwean plateau in Congo, in the 16th to 18th centuries, they outcompeted the Portuguese, who had come with their engineers from Europe to construct foundries. And the Portuguese, lo and behold, they couldn't penetrate the local market. In fact, they did not even have confidence in their own iron. And then they deferred to these locals in order to continue to be viable. Part of what I find interesting is the way in which these ironsmiths were able to manipulate air supply to initiate combustion and control it, to know what kind of trees were required to provide wood with good charcoal, and to be able to do so in such a way that they prepare the charcoal under specific conditions. That's science. There is no way we can go around it. That's science. So ironworking is one of the two activities that Chirikure looks at. The other one is pottery. pottery is interesting because it's practiced by women, mostly women in Africa. I've not heard of societies where men are to be found, making pots. Nor have I heard of, until perhaps the recent times, of any women smelting iron. Both were governed by taboos. If a woman comes anywhere near the furnace, the iron would not come out nicely. At the same time, if a man came anywhere near where women were making pots, they would crack. That was the taboo. Production could only take place under these specific conditions, nothing else. And before anything was done, these folks had to go before their ancestors and the gods of technology, if you want, to say this is what we are going to do. If anything failed, they would blame the failure to observe taboo. Taboo may sound strange, doesn't it? It's nothing more than the kinds of things that you do in science. Science has its own taboos here. The do's and don'ts under which an experiment is carried out. We often think of innovation as something that we who are free do. And if you look at the narrative of innovation, it is usually this independent spirit of creativity and risk-taking, particularly by the young. Think slavery. How do you innovate freedom? Or how do you innovate survival or a life under bondage? When your life has been reduced to nothing more than a machine of mass production on the plantation. That's the focus of Jeria Augusto's chapter. She is trying to reposition the transatlantic trade in Africans as slaves. I don't call it slave trade. As a technology transfer and innovation process. The argument she is making through seeds and medicines is an interesting one. That it's easy to say they were carriers of ready-made products from Africa or knowledge in their heads from Africa. That's easy to say. Some scholars have said that for rice, others for masonry, others for metals. The work of Candice Goucher, for example. But what she's saying is that in that space between departure and arrival, enslaved Africans had to survive. The only way you survived was to keep yourself with high morale. Of course, there was also the possibility that you could recuse yourself from the space of being molested by your captor and just jump overboard and end it and deny them profit. It's the other way. Still very creative under difficult circumstances. Or you could take only those resources that you had. There was nothing else to work with. And shift them in form, transform them in order to create something that would enable you to survive. So the space between departure and arrival was not a dead space. It was a creative space. What she calls the inter-trans, the in-between. At the same time, when they arrived, picture yourself arriving in a foreign environment where you have to eke out a living, even as you are enslaved. What she is calling attention to is to look at the slave quarters as an innovation space. I like this picture because it partly tells a biography of me growing up where a lot of things did not have space locally. It was during sanctions, and I saw the Rhodesian community innovating in very interesting ways, replacing imported parts with local ones that they could easily manufacture. And when they ran their life, they actually began to manufacture them locally. Examples include a lot of the Humvees that you see in the battlefields in the Middle East that are coming from Australia. Much of that R&D was Rhodesian made. These Rhodesians then migrated after independence. They did not want to be ruled by a black government. They migrated. That's one narrative. The other narrative that's interesting is that if you wanted your mom to cook food for you, you had to make the utensils necessary to process it. In pre-colonial Africa, for example, there were no hammer mills. There were no steam machines. The only way you could grind grain and produce meal was to produce mortar and pestle. And what you see in this picture is a process, a dad taking his son through the process of how you make one, and to the point until your mother actually pounds grain to make food for you. At MIT, we talk of mind and hand. This is as mind and hand as you can get. The subject of Tolu Odumosu's chapter is an interesting one, because you are hearing more and more now Africa being referred to as leapfrogging. For most of Africa, there was no fixed land line. Then comes cyber, which, by the way, did not come, cell phones, they did not come just by the grace of God, nor were they brought by foreigners. The pioneers of cell phones in Africa, who brought cellular phone to Africa, included people like Mikor Waitare, who founded Telecel. For us to have undersea cables that circumnavigated the Cape, that idea was pushed very vociferously by former South African President Thabo Mbeki. His argument was simple. There was one slot reserved for hosting the World Cup for 2010, and it would go to an African country. Now, which country would it be? Would it be Egypt? Egypt was too far north. In any case, it was almost right on the path of the undersea cables going to India. The argument that Mbeki was making was interesting. If Egypt gets the World Cup, Africa has lost its chance to have internet. It has lost that chance. So the only way it can have it is if the cup came to South Africa. We now know that if you look at the map, the cyber map of Africa, that has come to pass. Since then, we have seen interesting developments. We have seen innovations in mobile money with M-Pesa, which is revolutionizing not just African, how Africans move money. It's revolutionizing the way the whole world does mobile banking and so forth. The latest innovation is by Zipline International in Rwanda, a partnership that has resulted in the supply of blood to difficult-to-reach countries using drones. And this is now expanding into Tanzania. These things have policy implications. For example, how can a sensibility of Africa as the center of technology shape policy? And part of the reason why we produced this volume when we did is because we were concerned that the strategic plan for Africa, the science, technology, and innovation strategy for Africa, focuses on big science and national systems of innovation derived from mostly European countries whose economies are science intensive, they are research intensive. By contrast, 70% of Africa's economy is generated in the informal sector, produced by that everyday knowledge that I highlighted earlier on. So part of what Chuck Daniels does is to try and return us to that kind of conversation. Can we have something more sophisticated than just cutting and pasting? In closing, I've talked so far about what we did. This is what has happened since. The imperative now is to transform some of these findings into actual curriculum. And so we have been turning the networks that we built through this process into syllabi like this. For example, how about we take students to these sites like this forge here and taking seriously the science involved in this and combine it with engineering? What might we get? How about we take knowledge of grain storage under which Africans dug underground or constructed structures made of clay and heated them. And after heating, and it's cool, they put grain inside and then seal it, thereby ensuring that no weevils get in. What are we to make up of that? As opposed to using all these toxic pesticides to preserve grain. Finally, I'll say that one of the things that I've been trying to do is to demystify the purpose of education. And this is a matter that is dear to my heart. When we are educated, we leave the villages, the communities, and go abroad, we never come back. And many of these insights, as good as they were produced by academics. And these academics, what do? Does it just end in talk? I said earlier that Africa has a huge deficit of doers. A lot of critical thinkers who are not doers. A lot of doers who are not critical thinkers. The challenge personally was, what have I ever done? Because I want to change the whole of Africa. I want to change the world. What have I ever really done for my own little village? And so I wanted to challenge fellow academics who come from Africa to say, can't we be catalysts and builders? So I returned home, remodeled my own homestead into a kind of laboratory where I could try out, if I had ideas that I thought worked, why not try them out first to see if they work before I can propose them to governments? I can't just talk from, that's empty rhetoric. And as you spend substantial presence in the village, you realize that actually people, where they work every day, these are their own laboratories. Like this young man here who told me that if you want to see if one fertilizer works among 3 of them, just plant 3 crops, right? 3 plants, right? 1, 2, 3. And then put the same amount of fertilizer on each. 3 different. The one that grows more has justified itself as the better option. So you could come to that space as a learner and not just somebody who's telling people what to do. Finally, there is a concept that I talk about in the introduction called Nimbe, under which the society came together to do communal work, the whole village, to do communal work for women who were widowed, for orphans, or those that were too old to do work, or simply for those that had excelled and got overwhelmed by their own crop production. It's called Nimbe. It's an ethos of collective work. The idea that I was bringing back was, can't we do this again, but this time focusing on self-development in the village? The picture you see was taken this morning. It is a picture of us electrifying our own village, using that concept. It's not easy. There will be people who are still very individualistic, but it has turned out, once you cut off the rough edges, it has turned out to be a very, very successful model. Thank you very much for listening.
You remind me of an, excuse me, an experience I had recently with a community garden. It is near here. It is not individual plots for people in the community. It is done communally as a group, and many of the people in that, maybe most in that group, are engineers, and a lot of the engineers from MIT. And I learned from there that farmers, in the US at least, in the Western world, don't innovate. The industry of selling them products does the development, the innovation, and sells them answers to their questions, basically. So they don't ask questions at all themselves. But clearly in a village, you get this sense of being not just empowered, but required to ask and answer your own questions, or they will never be known. It seems a natural thing for a village environment, or a group large enough to be able to differentiate who is doing what work, but small enough that everyone is an individual and everyone can hear what one person has to say, to do that kind of innovation, to learn perhaps that one kind of tree blocks the wind better when the wind is making it difficult for young plants. So thank you for bringing that to light, but it very much clicked with me based on my personal experience.
Thank you so much.
I'm curious if you see one particular nation in Africa or a particular city or region as the most likely to sort of export the next world-changing technology, or if that doesn't really matter so much, and if you're more focused on some of the work you've shared today that really has direct local impact in communities.
Rwanda. Why? Because if you look at what President Paul Kagame is doing, he is willing to take risks. I was very impressed by the story that Kela Ronaldo from Zipline told me. He was saying that everybody else just laughed them off, basically. Even, the big pharmaceutical companies, the big foundations in the United States, let alone government. They just said, "You're crazy, little boy, get out of here." But Kagame was prepared to take the risk. And they piloted that it's a world's first, actually. So that on its own, what's happening is very interesting. You already have M-Pesa, so that, to say nothing of Ushaid. Now, one could say, oh, but these are people who are coming from outside, or the big corporations in the case of that are doing this. But why is it that it's possible in Africa? And what kind of infrastructures are they creating? Zipline is very interesting. Where it goes next will be critical. So I would say Rwanda, without any doubt. second to which would be Mauritius. I think the big innovation will be in problem-solving education. You have two institutions, one in Mauritius called African Leadership First Academy, then now university. And they are modeling their education system as declaring, a student declares not a major, but a mission. And one of their missions is to solve global challenges. Ashesi in Ghana is doing the same thing, I think differently though, but I would watch Rwanda and Mauritius.
I work on education initiatives at Google. I was wondering if you could provide a little bit more specific information about those examples that you just mentioned, where there are these educational models around mission, right, rather than knowledge for the sake of knowledge.
Yeah.
Where can I go and learn more information about that?
So the thing with African Leadership University is that there is a big vision. And they have started their journey to get there. And they are on a big recruitment drive. That's how I got to know that, in the interest of full disclosure. What interests me about them is that they are willing to gamble and take big risks and start entirely something new. They are not interested in settled waters, because when the water is crystal clear, you will see where the crocodile is. They are prepared to plunge in and gamble that the crocodiles will see that they are too brave, they must be banking on something, and back off. So their website is a good start, but they are very approachable in terms of, Fred Swanica, this founder himself, is very, very approachable. They are mixing this corporate style of doing things with, I can't say traditional way of delivering education, but that corporate style is interesting because when he has a vision, he can push it forward.
Please join me again in thanking Professor Mavhunga.
Thank you so much.